The morning James Graves rode onto the Sullivan homestead, he had every intention of burning it to the ground. Not literally. He was not that kind of man. But the orders Clifton Hale had given him were clear enough in their spirit. Ride out to the widow's spread on the edge of Broken Creek, make her understand that the land was no longer hers to hold, and come back with the deed in hand or don't bother coming back at all. Hale had said it with that particular smile of his, the one that never quite reached his eyes, the one that had a way of communicating that the alternative to success was something worse than failure. James had ridden for Hale for 3 years. He knew exactly what that smile meant. He crested the low ridge above the homestead just as the sun broke hard and golden over the eastern hills, and what he saw below stopped him cold in the saddle. Frances Sullivan was standing in the yard with a pitchfork, not in a threatening way, not in any way that suggested she had seen him or expected trouble. She was turning compost at the edge of her kitchen garden, working with the kind of focused, unhurried efficiency that told a man she had been doing physical labor since before she could read. Her hair was the color of dark copper, pulled back at the nape of her neck with something that might have been a ribbon or might have been a strip of leather, and the early light caught it in a way that made James forget, for approximately 3 full seconds, exactly why he had ridden out here. Then he remembered, and the forgetting made the remembering worse. He sat there on his horse for longer than he should have, watching her work, and in those minutes something happened inside him that he could not yet name. It felt like the sensation you get when you have been walking toward a cliff in the dark and your foot finds open air where ground should be. Not the falling, just the knowing. He rode down. She heard him coming before she saw him, the way people who have learned to pay attention to their surroundings always do. She set the pitchfork tines down in the earth and turned to face him without hurrying, and the expression on her face as he came across the yard was not fear and it was not welcome. It was assessment, pure, calm, and entirely unnerving. "You ride for Hale," she said. It was not a question. James pulled up 10 feet from her and took his hat off, a reflex of courtesy so ingrained he did it without thinking. "Yes, ma'am." "Then I already know why you are here," she said, "and the answer is no." He looked at her for a moment. She looked back. The morning wind moved between them. "It might be worth hearing me out first," he said. "It might," she agreed, "but it won't change the answer." That was 3 weeks ago. To understand how James Graves arrived at this moment, at the edge of a decision that would cost him everything he had built in 3 years of loyal service to Clifton Hale, you have to understand what Broken Creek was in the spring of 1882 and what it had been before Hale arrived. The territory that would become Broken Creek County had been cattle country for as long as anyone currently living there could remember, which was to say roughly 25 years, which was to say not nearly as long as the Comanche and the Kiowa would have dated their own tenure. But that was a different kind of accounting, and one the men running the territory's land offices had never been inclined to perform. By 1882, the buffalo were gone from the southern plains. The cattle drives up from Texas were beginning their long decline as the railroads pushed south and made the long trail unnecessary, and the men who had made their fortunes in beef were looking around for other ways to hold what they had and take what they could while the taking was still good. Clifton Hale was one of those men. He had come to Broken Creek in 1878 with enough capital to buy the largest existing ranch in the county, and enough political connection to ensure that the county assessor, the county judge, and the town marshal all understood where their continued good fortune lay. He had expanded steadily and not always fairly, and by the spring of 1882 he controlled roughly 40% of the usable grazing land in the county and intended to control 60% by summer. The obstacle, as he saw it, was the small landholders, the homesteaders, the people who had come under the Homestead Act of 1862 and proved up their claims and built something real on land that Hale wanted and believed, with the unshakable conviction of wealthy men, that he deserved. Frances Sullivan's 160 acres sat directly between two parcels that Hale already owned, and the creek that ran through it was the best water source within 8 miles. She had proved it up 2 years prior, after her husband Patrick had died of fever 6 months into their first winter on the claim. She had done it alone, which was to say she had done it with the help of her nearest neighbor, a former enslaved man named Robert Aldridge, who had homesteaded 40 acres to her north, and who had spent Patrick Sullivan's last conscious weeks helping Frances learn what Patrick had never taught her about running cattle and fixing fence and reading water. Robert was 61 years old and built like a man who had been working hard land since childhood because he had been, and he was the kind of neighbor who understood that community was not a courtesy, but a survival mechanism. He and Frances had an arrangement that was entirely practical and entirely dignified, and that Clifton Hale had been trying to disrupt for the better part of a year, because Hale understood that Frances alone was vulnerable, and Frances with allies was a problem. This was the world James Graves rode into on the morning. He pulled up in Frances Sullivan's yard with his hat in his hand and his orders in his pocket, and a feeling he could not name spreading through his chest like water, finding the level of its ground. He had grown up in Missouri, the third son of a farmer who had come home from the war between the states with one arm and a grief that never fully lifted, and he had come west at 19, with the specific intention of becoming someone different from the man he had been raised to be. He had done ranch work, some trail driving, a season of work for the railroad that he did not like to think about, and then 3 years for Clifton Hale, which he had told himself was temporary, and then had simply stopped telling himself anything about it because the money was good and the work, until recently, had been the kind he could perform without examining too closely. He was 27 years old, and he was, without being fully aware of it, exactly ripe for the kind of revelation that Frances Sullivan was about to represent to him. On that first morning, he stayed long enough to deliver Hale's offer, which was to buy her out at 40 cents on the dollar of the land's assessed value, which both of them knew was an insult designed to provoke either capitulation or escalation rather than actual negotiation. Frances listened to the whole thing with her arms crossed and the pitchfork still standing in the dirt beside her like a sentinel. When he finished, she said, "Tell Mr. Hale that I understand his offer and that my answer is still no, and that if he sends someone back out here with anything other than a genuine price, I will be writing to the Territorial Land Office in Austin, and I will be copying that letter to the editor of the newspaper in San Angelo, who is a personal friend of mine from my time in Ohio." James looked at her. "You're from Ohio? Does that surprise you? Most of the women who homestead out here came from somewhere closer." "Most of the women who homestead out here," she said, "came with husbands who did not die in the first winter." There was no self-pity in it, just fact. He registered that. "I'll relay the message," he said, and put his hat back on and rode back to Hale's ranch. Hale did not take it well. The scene in Hale's office that evening was the kind of scene James had witnessed enough times to navigate with his face neutral, and his opinions stored somewhere that Hale's particular radar couldn't reach. Hale paced behind his desk with a glass of whiskey in his hand, and talked about water rights and carrying capacity, and the inherent wastefulness of a woman trying to run cattle alone, as if the argument he was making was practical rather than predatory. He had a gift for that, for taking what was essentially naked greed and clothing it in the language of efficiency and progress and the natural order of things. "Go back," Hale said finally. "Take Murdoch with you this time. Make it clear to her that this isn't a negotiation." James thought about the pitchfork standing in the dirt. He thought about the steadiness in her eyes. "She'll write to Austin," he said. "Let her write," Hale said. "By the time anyone in Austin reads it, the deed will already be transferred." James rode back out to the Sullivan homestead the following Tuesday, alone. He had not brought Murdoch. He had told Murdoch that Hale had changed the plan, which was a lie, and he had spent the 2 days between that decision and this morning trying to understand why he had made it. She was in the garden again when he rode up. This time she had a hoe. She saw him coming from further off, and she set the hoe against the fence post and stood waiting with the particular stillness that he was already beginning to understand was just the way she occupied space. "Alone this time," she said. "Yes. That's interesting." He dismounted and stood with his reins in his hands. "I don't have a new offer. I want to be honest with you about that." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Then why are you here?" "I wanted to ask you something." "Ask. Why haven't you sold? Not to Hale, I don't mean, but to anyone. The land is worth real money. You could take a fair price and go somewhere easier than this." She was quiet for a moment, looking at him with an expression he couldn't fully read. Then she said, "Come have some coffee and I'll tell you." He tied his horse to the fence post and followed her inside. The interior of the house surprised him, not because it was fine, because it was not, but because it was so deliberately and specifically itself. There were books stacked on a shelf made from a piece of packing crate. There was a curtain in the window that had been embroidered in a pattern of small blue flowers, and the stitching was expert enough that it must have taken weeks. There was a photograph on the mantel of a man and a woman who were younger than they looked, standing in front of something that might have been a storefront or a house, and James looked at it for a moment while Frances built up the stove. "That's Patrick," she said without turning around. "And me, the year before we came west. He looks like a good man." "He was," she said. "He was also entirely unprepared for this country, which I think I knew even then and chose not to examine too closely." He sat down at the table, which was a real table, solid and square, the kind of thing that takes intention to build. She set 2 tin mugs on it and poured from the pot that had been sitting at the back of the stove, and then she sat across from him and looked at him in that direct, unsettling way she had. "Patrick wanted this land," she said. "He read about the Homestead Act, and he saw it as the chance he'd never have otherwise, a real chance to own something, to build something that his children and their children would stand on. He talked about it for 2 years before we actually came. I know every argument he made for it by heart because I've had to make those arguments to myself every single bad day for the past 2 years. And there have been bad days," James said. "There have been extraordinary bad days," she said without drama. "But the land is mine now. I proved it up. I paid the price for it, and I don't mean the filing fee. And I'm not going to hand it over to a man like Clifton Hale so that he can run a few hundred more head of cattle on it and feel larger than he already imagines himself to be." James looked at his coffee. He thought about the orders in his pocket. He thought about Hale's smile. "He's not going to stop," James said. "I want you to know that. This isn't a situation where if you hold firm long enough he moves on. He wants the water, he'll keep pushing." She studied him for a long moment. "Are you warning me?" "I think I might be." "Why?" He didn't have a good answer for that, not yet. He said, "I'm not sure, but I think you should be prepared for it to get harder." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you, Mr. Graves. That's the most honest thing anyone riding for Clifton Hale has ever said to me." He rode back to Hale's ranch and reported that Frances Sullivan had again declined the offer and that she had reiterated her intention to contact the land office. Hale looked at him for a moment with those flat, measuring eyes and then said, "Fine. We'll try a different approach." James did not ask what the different approach was. He went to the bunkhouse, lay on his cot, and stared at the ceiling for a long time, thinking about a woman with copper-colored hair and a straight spine, and a table that someone had built with real intention. The different approach, as it turned out, involved Hale's lawyer filing a challenge to the water rights attached to Frances's claim on the grounds that the creek's source originated on Hale's upper pasture, and therefore the water itself was his property regardless of whose land it ran through. It was the kind of legal argument that had enough technical complexity to require months of adjudication, and the intended effect was not to win in court, but to drain Frances's resources fighting it. James found out about the filing from one of the other hands who had overheard it at the feed store in town. He rode back to the Sullivan homestead that same afternoon, 2 days before the official notice would have reached her by post. She was at the fence line when he arrived, replacing wire where something had broken through, working methodically with fencing pliers and a spool of barbed wire, wearing thick leather gloves. She looked up when she heard him coming, and something in his expression must have told her that this was not a social call, because she set down the pliers immediately and pulled off her gloves. "What is it?" he told her. The expression that moved across her face was not panic, and it was not despair, and it was not defeat. It was fury, clean and controlled, the kind of anger that a person has learned to hold in a shape that makes it useful rather than consuming. She stood very still for a moment with the gloves in her hand, and then she said, "He's filing on the water rights. Yes, that will cost me money I don't have to fight. Yes, unless I find a different approach." He watched her. "What kind of approach?" She looked at him with an expression that was partly calculation and partly something else, something he couldn't quite name yet. "You know this territory. You know Hale's operation. If there were other people in this county who stood to lose from that water rights argument, people with more legal standing and more resources than I have, would you know who they were?" He thought about it. He knew the county, yes. He had ridden every inch of it for 3 years. "Ed Marron has water from the same creek system on his south pasture," he said slowly. "And the Garvey brothers. If Hale's argument holds, it wouldn't just affect you. It would affect every downstream claim." "Then they have the same fight I have," she said. "They might not see it that way. Marron's been trying to stay neutral." "Neutral is a position you can afford when no one has come for your water yet," she said. He looked at her. There it was again, that quality of mind, the way she moved directly from problem to strategy without the intermediate step of being overwhelmed by the problem. He had met very few people in his life who could do that. "I could help you make those introductions," he said, and then stopped, hearing what he had said. She heard it too. Something shifted slightly in her expression. "Why would you do that, Mr. Graves? You ride for the man who is trying to take my land." "Ride for Hale," he said. "I don't own his intentions." She was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved through the dry grass around them with a sound like something trying to say a word it didn't know yet. "That's a distinction that could cost you considerably," she said. "I know." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, "All right, Mr. Graves. Let's go talk to Ed Marron." What followed over the next 2 weeks was the most alive James Graves had felt in 3 years, possibly longer. They rode together twice, then 3 times, calling on the neighboring homesteaders and small ranchers, making the case that Hale's water rights claim was not a targeted attack on one woman but a strategic move that, if successful, would threaten every non-Hale operation in the watershed. Frances made the argument with a clarity and a force that James found himself watching with something close to awe. She was not a speechmaker in the theatrical sense. She didn't perform. She simply laid out the facts and the logic and the stakes with such evident intelligence and such complete absence of manipulation that people believed her because disbelieving her would have required them to be less honest than she was demanding they be. Marron came around after their second conversation. The Garvey brothers took one meeting. A woman named Clara Hutchins, who ran 50 head on a creek claim to the east, signed on immediately and without hesitation. And Frances's expression when they rode away from the Hutchins place told James that finding Clara had felt like finding a sister she hadn't known she had. They were riding back from the Hutchins place on an evening in late April when the sunset over the western hills turned the sky the particular shade of burned orange that the Texas sky does better than any sky James had ever seen, and Frances, who had been talking through the legal strategy with the focused energy she brought to everything, suddenly stopped mid-sentence and looked at the sky. "Lord," she said quietly, "it is beautiful out here." James looked at her looking at the sky, and something in his chest did the thing it had been trying to do for 2 weeks, the thing he had been carefully not acknowledging. "Yes," he said, "it is." She glanced at him and caught something in his expression, and for a moment there was a different kind of silence between them, the kind that is not empty but full of things that have not been said yet because the right moment has not arrived. Then she looked back at the trail and said, matter-of-factly, "You should think about what you're going to do about Hale." "I know." He'll find out you've been helping me if he hasn't already. I know that too. What will you do? He thought about the bunkhouse and the cot and the ceiling and the years of work that had purchased exactly nothing except wages and the absence of alternatives. I don't know yet, he said. But I'll figure it out, she nodded as if this were an acceptable answer. Then she said, for what it's worth, whatever you decide, what you've done these past 2 weeks has made a difference. A real difference. You should know that. He nodded and looked at the trail ahead, and if his jaw was set a little harder than usual, it was because he was trying to hold in place something that wanted very much to move. Hale found out on a Thursday. James knew the moment he walked into the main house and saw Hale standing behind his desk with his whiskey glass in his hand, and that particular stillness that meant he was deciding how to be angry. The other man in the room was Murdoch, Hale's enforcer in the ways that required muscle rather than paperwork, and Murdoch was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and his expression the careful blank of someone who has been told to witness rather than participate. You've been talking to Maron, Hale said. James stood in the doorway. He did not pretend not to know what this was about. Yes, and the Garveys, and Clara Hutchins. Hale set down the glass with a deliberate quiet that was worse than noise. With the Sullivan woman. Yes. Hale looked at him for a long moment. I sent you out there to run her off, James. 3 times. 3 times you came back with nothing. I came back with the truth about where she stood, James said, which is that she's not going to be pushed off that land by an unfair offer or a manufactured legal claim. That's not what I asked you to determine, Hale said. No, James said. It isn't. There was a silence. Murdoch shifted against the wall but did not speak. I've been good to you, Hale said, and his voice had that quality now, that particular quality that was not quite a threat but was threat adjacent, the way a storm cloud is adjacent to the rain. 3 years of good wages, a place to sleep, food, work. Loyalty, James. I expected loyalty. James thought about Frances standing in the sunset saying it is beautiful out here. He thought about the 2 years she had spent alone on a claim that had already cost her a husband, building something real, making a life from the raw material of will and stubbornness and love for a dead man's dream. He thought about what Hale's smile looked like and what it meant. I'm giving notice, James said. Hale blinked. The words had apparently not been the ones he expected. I'm sorry. I'm giving notice. I'll leave today. He reached into his jacket and took out the small folded packet of papers that represented his current employment agreement, the standing orders and the wage notes, and he laid them on the edge of Hale's desk. I won't be coming back. Murdoch had unfolded himself from the wall. James registered this without turning his head. You walk out that door, Hale said slowly, and I will make sure you never work in this county again. I will make sure Maron and the Garveys know you were playing both sides. I will tell them whatever you like, James said. I imagine they'll draw their own conclusions. He turned and walked out of the room. Murdoch did not follow him. James half expected to hear footsteps behind him, and then to have to deal with whatever came next. But the footsteps did not come, and he walked through the main house and out the front door and across the yard to the bunkhouse, where he rolled his bedroll, collected his few personal items into his saddlebags, and went to the stable to saddle his horse. He rode out of the Hale Ranch gates at 2 in the afternoon on a Thursday in late April 1882, with $34 in wages, a horse that was technically his own, a bedroll, a change of clothes, a Colt revolver, and no plan. He rode north. He was not entirely conscious of where he was going until he was most of the way there, and by the time he acknowledged it to himself, he was already cresting the ridge above Frances Sullivan's homestead, the same ridge he had crested 3 weeks ago with entirely different intentions, and the late afternoon light was falling across the valley below in long golden bars that made the whole thing look like something from a picture. She was at the barn when he rode down. Not the garden this time, not the fence line, but the barn, doing something with one of the horses inside. She came to the barn door when she heard him approaching and looked at him with that level, assessing gaze, and then she looked at the saddlebags behind his saddle. "You left," she said. "Yes. Hale, he knows. I told him I was done and I left." She looked at him for a moment. Something moved in her expression, something careful and considered. "Where are you going?" "I don't know yet," he said. "I wanted to tell you first, about Hale knowing, about me leaving. I thought you should know directly rather than hear it some other way." She nodded slowly. "He'll move now," she said. "Knowing you've defected, he'll want to move quickly before you can help us further." "Yes. I think you have maybe a week before something happens. Then we have a week to get our ducks in a row legally." She was already thinking, he could see it in the way her eyes went slightly unfocused, the internal calculation happening. Then she refocused on him. "Have you eaten?" "Not since this morning." "Then come inside," she said. "We need to think, and you can't think well when you're hungry." He tied his horse and went inside. And this time the house felt different to him, or he felt different in it. Because the last time he had sat at her table he had still been, in some technical sense, Clifton Hale's man. And now he was nobody's man, which was terrifying and also, in a way he had not expected, something very close to relief. She fed him beans and cornbread, and told him what she knew about the water rights filing, and what the lawyer she had consulted in town had told her about the likely timeline. Her lawyer was a young man named Ellis Crawford, who had come to Broken Creek 2 years prior, and was still hungry enough for work to take cases that a more established practice might have declined. And he had done sufficient research to believe that Hale's water rights claim had real vulnerabilities if the downstream landholders could be organized into a collective opposition. "The problem," Frances said, setting her fork down, "is that Ellis thinks we need a surveyor's testimony about the creek's actual origin point. Hale's claim depends on the creek sourcing entirely from his upper pasture, which Ellis doesn't think is accurate. There's a spring on the public grazing land to the north that contributes to the flow, and if we can document that, the argument falls apart." "I know that spring," James said immediately. "I've watered horses there. It's on the section that was reserved from homesteading when the county was organized." Frances leaned forward slightly. "Can you take a surveyor there and testify to that?" "Yes." "Will you?" He looked at her across the table, across the cornbread and the tin mugs and the lamplight, and he said, "Frances, I just handed in my notice and rode here. Yes, I will do whatever needs doing." She held his gaze for a moment and then looked down at the table, and when she looked back up there was something different in her expression, something that had come loose from its careful anchoring and was showing itself briefly before she put it back. "Thank you," she said, quietly, in a different voice than the strategic voice, the organizing voice, just her voice. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "Let's see how it goes." It went over the following days, with the particular intensity of people working against a deadline they can feel but not precisely calculate. James was not staying at the Sullivan homestead, not exactly. He had bedded down the first night in the barn at Robert Aldridge's place to the north, and Robert, who assessed him with 70 times more wisdom per square inch than most men James had ever met, had looked him over carefully and said, "You're the one who's been helping Frances with the water thing." "Yes, sir." "And you've left Hale's employ?" "This afternoon." Robert was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You can stay here as long as you need to. I've got a spare stall that's cleaner than most men deserve." James slept in the barn stall and ate breakfast with Robert most mornings, and spent his days either at the Sullivan homestead or in town with Ellis Crawford, working through the legal preparation with an intensity that he had never previously applied to anything that wasn't directly in his own interest. He was not pretending to himself any more about what was driving this. He knew perfectly well what was driving it. Frances Sullivan was driving it, her intelligence and her stubbornness, and the way she looked at a problem as something to be solved rather than survived, and the way she had said thank you across the lamplight in a voice that was just her voice. They rode to the northern spring with Ellis Crawford and a surveyor named Portman on the 4th day after James had left Hale's employ. It was a long ride, half a day each way, and they were a party of four: James, Frances, Ellis, and Portman, with Robert Aldridge joining them for the first leg and then peeling off to attend to his own stock. The spring was exactly where James had said it was, a reliable upwelling on public land that fed directly into the creek system, and Portman spent 2 hours taking his measurements and recording everything in his notebook with the meticulous care of a man who knew that his documentation would need to be unimpeachable. Frances spent those 2 hours talking to Ellis about the filing strategy, pacing slowly along the creek bank while James stood nearby and watched and thought. At one point she came and stood beside him, looking at the water where it ran clear and cold over the flat stones of the creek bed. "My father used to say that water finds its level," she said, "that you can redirect it temporarily, but it always finds its way to where it needs to go. That sounds like a man who was comfortable with patience." She smiled, and it was the first full smile he had seen from her, unheld and unguarded, and it rearranged something in him permanently. "He was the most patient man I've ever known. Drove my mother absolutely wild." He laughed, actually laughed, which surprised him. She looked at him with that smile still in place and said, "You should do that more often." "What?" "Laugh. You have a very good laugh." He looked at her and she looked at him, and the creek ran between the stones with its cold, clear sound, and they were standing close enough that he could have reached out and touched her hand, and for a moment the whole world narrowed down to that potential. Then Portman called out something about a measurement, and the moment passed, and they walked back to where the surveyor was working, side by side, not quite touching, with something new and unspoken walking alongside them. Hale made his move on a Saturday. James was at the Sullivan homestead that morning, helping Frances repair the roof of the chicken coop where a section of the wooden shingles had come loose in the wind, when they saw 2 riders coming down from the ridge, not from the direction of town. From the direction of Hale's spread. James stood up on the coop roof and shaded his eyes and looked at the riders for a long moment before he stepped down. "Murdoch," he said. "And someone I don't recognize." Frances had come out of the house at the sound and was standing in the yard looking toward the ridge. "What do they want?" "Nothing good," James said. He came down off the coop and stood in the yard beside her and waited. Murdoch rode up with the other man and stopped his horse 20 feet out. He looked at James with an expression that was not quite surprise but was not entirely unsurprised either. He had not expected to find James here. "Sullivan," he said, without any title. "Mr. Hale's come to an agreement with the county assessor regarding the back taxes on this property. Seems you're in arrears 2 years running. He sent me to notify you that the county will be seizing this property at the end of next week unless the back taxes are paid in full." Frances's expression did not change. "I am not in arrears," she said calmly. "My taxes are current. I paid them in March at the county office in person, and I have the receipt." "The county records don't reflect that payment," Murdoch said. "Then the county records are wrong," she said. "Or more likely they've been altered, which is a matter I will be raising with the circuit court judge." Murdoch looked at her for a moment and then at James. "You're out here helping her," he said to James. "You know what Hale thinks of that." "I expect he's mentioned it," James said. "He's going to make things hard for you, Graves. He's welcome to try." Murdoch held his gaze for a moment longer, and then he pulled his horse around and rode back up toward the ridge with the other man behind him. Frances waited until they were out of earshot. Then she said very quietly, "He had the tax records changed." "That's what it sounds like." "That's fraud." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, thinking, and then she turned to James and said, "I have the receipt in the house. I keep every document, every record, every piece of paper. Patrick taught me that much. I have the receipt with the county clerk's stamp on it, dated March 4th. "Then we take that to Ellis," James said, "and Ellis takes it to the circuit court judge, and we make it part of the same filing." She looked at him, he looked at her. The morning sun was hard and bright above them, and somewhere in the chicken coop the repaired section of roof was already doing its job. "We're going to beat him," she said, not a prediction, a statement of intent. "Yes," James said, "we are." What happened next in James's inner life was less dramatic than it might sound, and more profound than words do full justice to. It was not a single moment of declaration or revelation, but rather an accumulation, a layering of small things into something that became, incrementally, unignorable. It was the receipt stored in a tin box under the floorboard, because Frances kept every document, every record, because she had learned from loss that the things you could prove were the only protection you had. It was the way she talked to Robert Aldridge, with the ease and respect of people who had built real trust through shared difficulty. It was the way she dealt with Clara Hutchins and the other neighbors who came into their coalition, direct and honest without being blunt to the point of alienation. It was the way she read in the evenings, the small stack of books worn from use, the kerosene lamp turned down low to conserve oil. It was the way she asked him questions about himself, not as a social obligation but from genuine curiosity, with follow-up questions that indicated she had been listening to his previous answers. He had told her, over successive evenings at her table or sitting outside in the last of the light, more about himself than he had told anyone in a long time. About Missouri and his father and the farm, about the years of drifting west, about the work for the railroad that he still did not like to think about and that she did not press him on once he mentioned it, only said, "I think there's work that marks you and work that doesn't, and I think you know the difference," and he had felt, for the first time in a long time, completely understood. He had told her that he did not know what came next, after all this was settled. That he had wages enough to last a few months if he was careful, and no immediate plans, and the general intention to find work that was honest and stop pretending that ambiguity was neutrality. She had said quietly, without looking at him directly, "There's always work out here for someone who knows cattle and knows land and is willing to be honest." He had not answered immediately, and she had not pushed, and the evening had moved on, but the sentence stayed with him like something placed with deliberate care in a location where he would keep returning to find it. The circuit court judge, a man named Hollis Brandt who rode circuit through 4 counties, and who had the particular quality of incorruptibility that comes from having no remaining political ambitions, received their consolidated filing on a Wednesday morning and set a hearing for the following Monday. Ellis Crawford had done remarkable work, assembling the tax receipt with its unambiguous county stamp, Portman's survey documentation of the Northern Spring, signed statements from Marone and the Garveys and Clara Hutchins about their own water dependency, and a careful legal argument that Hale's water rights claim was not only factually unsupported but procedurally fraudulent. Hale, apparently learning about the filing that same Wednesday, did something that surprised no one who understood him, and would have surprised anyone who had only heard his public presentations about being a reasonable man of business. He sent 3 riders to the Aldridge property, with the stated intention of purchasing Robert's 40 acres at a price that was not 40 cents on the dollar but was still well below value, and with an unstated but clearly implied corollary that the alternative to selling was a series of difficulties that a man in Robert Aldridge's position, a black man in post-Reconstruction Texas, would find very hard to navigate. Robert sent them away with a calm and a dignity that made James, who heard about it from Robert himself the following morning, feel something dense and complicated in his chest about all the ways the world was arranged to make things harder for some people than for others. "He thinks threatening me will hurt Frances," Robert said. He was sitting at his own table, which was smaller than Frances's but equally solid, drinking his own coffee, which was better than Frances's. "He's right that it would hurt her if I lost this place. She'd blame herself." "What are you going to do?" James asked. "I'm going to go to the hearing on Monday and give the testimony Ellis asked me to give," Robert said, "and then I'm going to come home and do what I always do, which is farm my land and mind my business, and not give Clifton Hale the satisfaction of seeing me afraid of him." James looked at the older man across the table. "How do you do that?" he asked. The not afraid part. Robert looked at him with the expression of someone who has been asked this question before in various forms by people who were genuinely trying to understand something. I've been afraid of men like Hale my whole life, he said. There was a time when men like Hale could do things that men like you couldn't even imagine. I've carried that fear for 60 years, but I made a decision a long time ago that the fear wouldn't make my decisions for me. The fear can come along if it wants to, but it doesn't drive. James sat with that for a while and then nodded and finished his coffee. The Monday hearing was, in the language of legal proceedings, decisive. Judge Brandt was a tall, thin man with very little tolerance for the waste of his time, and the documentation Ellis Crawford laid before him was so thorough and so unambiguously damaging to Hale's position that the hearing lasted less than 2 hours. The tax receipt was genuine, and the county records had been altered, a fact that the judge noted would require its own investigation into county clerk's office conduct. The survey documentation demonstrated conclusively that the creek source was not confined to Hale's property. The signed statements from the downstream landholders established the scope of potential damage from Hale's claim. Judge Brandt dismissed the water rights claim in its entirety, ordered the county tax records restored to their accurate state, and noted in his written decision that the pattern of conduct he had observed suggested that further investigation into the operations of certain parties in Broken Creek County might be warranted by the appropriate authorities. He also, in a quiet aside to Ellis after the formal proceedings, mentioned that he would be writing a letter to the district land office. Frances stood in the street outside the courthouse in the bright morning light with Ellis on one side and Robert on the other and James a step behind her, and she did not cry and she did not shout, but there was something about the way she stood, the way the tension of weeks resolved itself through her spine, that was more expressive than either of those things. She turned and looked at James. "It's over," she said. "The water rights part," he said. "Hale's not going to disappear." "No," she said. "But he's lost the legal angle, and he knows we'll fight everything else the same way. It's not over, but the worst of it is over." He nodded. She looked at him for a moment with that expression he had been seeing more and more, the one that was not fully armored, the one that let things through. "I owe you a great deal," she said. "You know that." "You don't owe me anything," he said. "I made choices I should have made a lot sooner." "That's not how debts work," she said, and there was something almost fond in it, almost teasing, and it was such a departure from the careful formality of their early interactions that he felt himself smile. Robert Aldridge, who was nobody's fool, looked between the two of them and said, "I'm going to get something to eat," and walked away with the unhurried purposefulness of a man who has correctly read a situation and chosen to excuse himself from it. Ellis, who was younger and less perceptive, started to say something about the legal costs, caught Frances's expression and said, I'll send the bill to the office," and followed Robert. James and Frances stood in the street outside the courthouse in the May sunlight. "What are you going to do now?" she asked. He thought about the question. He had been thinking about it for days, turning it in different directions, examining what he wanted and whether he was prepared to ask for it, and what he was afraid of and whether the fear drove or only rode along. "I was thinking," he said carefully, "about whether there might be work on a ranch in this county that needed doing by someone who knows cattle and knows land." She looked at him steadily. "Is that what you were thinking about? Among other things." "What other things?" He held her gaze. "I was thinking about whether the person who runs that ranch might be interested in a conversation about things that aren't strictly related to water rights or tax records or fence repairs." Frances Sullivan, who had been a homesteader alone for 2 years and a widow and a fighter and the most capable person James Graves had ever met, looked at him in the sunlight outside the Broken Creek courthouse and said, "I've been waiting for you to have that conversation for approximately 3 weeks, Mr. Graves." He took a breath. "Then I've been considerably slower than I should have been." "Considerably," she agreed. But she was smiling now, the full smile, the one that rearranged things permanently. He stepped closer to her. She didn't step back. He said, "Frances," and she said, "James," and they stood there in the morning light on the main street of Broken Creek, Texas, in May of 1882, with the distance between them reduced to approximately the width of a decision. He reached out and took her hand, which was not smooth or soft but was warm and steady and entirely, specifically itself, and she let him hold it, and the decision was made. The weeks that followed were a different kind of work, the work of two people who have decided toward each other, beginning to build something that is more complex and more fragile than a legal case or a fence line, but also, in its own way, more necessary. James moved from Robert's barn to a small room he rented in town at first, maintaining a propriety that the community of Broken Creek required, and that both he and Frances accepted as reasonable, even as they found it increasingly inconvenient. He had found work quickly enough, as it turned out, because Ed Marrow needed a reliable hand who knew the territory and was not affiliated with Hale, and the pay was fair, and the work was honest, and James found himself doing it with a sense of purpose that 3 years riding for Hale had never provided. He came to the Sullivan homestead in the evenings after work. Sometimes there was something specific to be done, a fence post to be set or a roof repair to be completed or a piece of equipment that needed fixing. Often there was not. Often they just sat at her table or outside in the long summer evenings and talked, and the things they said to each other ranged from entirely practical to deeply personal in a way that felt natural rather than forced, as if they had been talking to each other for much longer than they had. He learned things about her that added themselves to the accumulation he was already carrying. That she had been a school teacher in Ohio for 2 years before she married Patrick, and that she missed teaching with a specific and particular ache. That she had a gift for numbers that she referred to deprecatingly as just common sense, but that Ellis Crawford would have called something more impressive. That she had learned to shoot in the first winter, alone after Patrick's death, from a manual she had found in Patrick's trunk, and that she was better at it than most men gave her credit for because most men assumed she wasn't. He told her things in return, things he had not told many people. About the railroad work, which had involved participating in operations that displaced farming communities in a manner he now understood had parallels to exactly what Hale had tried to do to her, and which had left a residue of self-reproach that he had mostly managed by simply not thinking about it. She listened to this without either excusing it or condemning him for it, only said, "The question isn't what you did when you didn't know better. It's what you do now that you do." He turned that over for several days and decided she was right. Clifton Hale was not, as James had predicted, gone from their lives simply because the legal strategy had failed. But Judge Brandt's decision and the attendant attention from the district land office had apparently concentrated Hale's calculations in ways that made direct aggression against the Sullivan homestead significantly riskier than it had been. He was not a man who abandoned ambitions, but he was a man who understood costs and benefits, and the cost of going after Frances directly had, at least for the time being, come to exceed the benefit. He did not attempt anything else that summer. This did not mean he was gone. It meant he was waiting. James knew this because he knew the man, and Frances knew it because she was Frances, and they both operated accordingly, keeping their documentation current and their coalition intact, and their attention on the horizon. But the absence of active crisis gave them space. Summer in the Texas Hill Country was hard and beautiful and relentless, and Frances's cattle, a small herd of 20 head that she had been building carefully over 2 years, needed the work that James had grown up knowing how to give them. He helped her through the summer with a combination of his own expertise and a willingness to take direction from her that he suspected some men would have found difficult, because she knew her own operation better than he did, and he was smart enough to recognize this and act accordingly. She noticed that he took direction well. "Most men who know what they're doing," she said one afternoon when they were working cattle together in the small corral, "have a hard time taking instruction from a woman, even when she's right." "Most men," he said, easing a steer into the corner with practiced patience, are wasting a considerable amount of their intelligence on pride. She laughed, the full laugh now, the one he had been hearing more and more of, and the steer took advantage of the moment to make a break for the gate. By the late summer it had become apparent to everyone in Broken Creek County's small social universe that James Graves and Frances Sullivan were courting, which was the word that was used, and the responses ranged from warm approval, Robert Aldridge, Clara Hutchins, Ed Marron, to slightly scandalized fascination, most of the town of Broken Creek, to studied indifference, the Garvey brothers, who were not the most socially attuned individuals in the county. No one who knew Frances was particularly surprised. Most people who watched them together understood why. He asked her to marry him in September. They were sitting outside in the long evening light, the western sky doing that thing it did in early fall when the heat began to lift, and the light went a particular quality of gold that was different from summer gold, softer and longer. And she was reading one of her books, and he had been watching the light and thinking about the question he had been carrying for approximately 6 weeks. He said, "Frances." She looked up from the book. He said, "I know I don't have much right now. I've got a few months of savings and work for Marron and the horse, and that's essentially the sum of my material assets. And I know that what you've built here is yours, and I don't want you to think that I'm in any way suggesting that I have a claim on it just because." "James," she said. He stopped. "Is there a question somewhere in there?" she said, and her eyes were very bright and her voice was doing the thing where it was careful and warm at the same time. He took a breath. "Will you marry me?" She set the book down. She looked at him for a moment that felt like it lasted considerably longer than it actually did. "Yes," she said, "on one condition." "Name it." "That you stop apologizing for not having enough," she said. "You came onto my land 3 months ago as an enemy, and you left your job and helped me fight for everything I'd built, and you've spent every evening since then making this place better and talking to me like I'm a person worth talking to. James, you are more than enough. Please stop suggesting otherwise." He looked at her. She looked back at him with that direct, clear gaze. "Yes," he said. "All right." "Good," she said. She reached over and took his hand, the same gesture he had made in the street outside the courthouse, but hers now, initiated and certain. "Yes, I'll marry you." They were married in November, at the Methodist Church in Broken Creek, in a ceremony attended by Robert Aldridge and his wife Maggie, Clara Hutchins and her 2 boys, Ed Marron and his family, Ellis Crawford with his new wife who had only recently arrived from San Antonio, and approximately 30 other members of the Broken Creek community who had been following the story of the Sullivan homestead with considerable personal investment. Frances wore a dress she had made herself from fabric she had ordered from a dry goods catalog in August, a deep blue wool that was the color of a winter sky, and she wore her hair done up in a way that Maggie Aldridge had helped her arrange that morning. And when James saw her come through the church doors on Robert Aldridge's arm, because she had asked Robert to stand with her, and Robert had accepted with the dignity and the visible emotion of someone who understood exactly what was being asked and what it meant, James did something he had not done since he was very young. He felt his eyes fill. He blinked it back, mostly, and Frances, coming down the aisle toward him, saw it, and her expression did something very specific that had nothing to do with the careful, measured woman who had turned to face him with a pitchfork in the yard that first morning. It was the expression of someone who has been hoping for something and has found that the thing they hoped for is real. The minister was a man named Reardon who performed the ceremony with the appropriate amount of solemnity and significantly less of the extended theological elaboration that some ministers of his acquaintance indulged in, which was a mercy. James said his vows looking directly at Frances. Frances said hers looking directly at him. When it was done and Reardon said what needed to be said, James kissed her for the first time in front of 30 people and a minister and God, and the church erupted in the kind of genuine, unperformed celebration that happens when people are genuinely happy for other people. Robert Aldridge, who was not a man given to public demonstrations of emotion, wiped his eye with considerable discretion and then cleared his throat loudly and said that there was food outside, which redirected enough attention to allow him to recover his composure. The reception was in the open air behind the church, because no building in Broken Creek was large enough to accommodate 30 people in any comfort, and the day was clear and cold and brilliant, and there was food and there was music from 2 fiddles and a guitar, and Frances danced with a looseness and a joy that James had not seen in her before, as if she had been holding something in careful reserve for a very long time and had decided to let it out. He danced badly and she told him so, laughing, and he said that he would take instruction if she was willing to provide it. And she said that she was always willing to provide instruction to a student who was genuinely interested in learning. And he pulled her closer, and they were both laughing and the fiddles were playing, and the Texas stars were beginning to come out overhead, vast and cold and indifferent in the best way. The way that makes the small human warmth below them feel precious rather than insignificant. Winter on the Sullivan homestead, as it now was and as it would remain, though the deed would be amended in the county records to read Sullivan Graves, and then amended again the following year simply to Graves Sullivan, when Frances decided that she preferred the sound of it, was hard work in close quarters, and the specific intimacy of 2 people who had chosen each other, learning the detailed reality of living with each other. They discovered things. That James woke before dawn without any particular effort, and that Frances required about 15 additional minutes of convincing before she was ready to face the morning, and that this worked out functionally because he built the fire and made the coffee, and by the time she appeared the kitchen was warm and the day was possible. That Frances had opinions about the arrangement of objects that James initially took as arbitrary but eventually understood were founded in a kind of spatial logic that, once he grasped it, he found himself adopting. That they disagreed about money, specifically about the pace at which to expand the herd, him more cautious and her more willing to take calculated risk, and that these disagreements were conducted with a frankness and a mutual respect that reached resolution without leaving residue. They discovered that they were, in the most fundamental sense, genuinely compatible, which was not something that could have been predicted with certainty, and which both of them appreciated with the quiet gratitude of people who understood that it was not guaranteed. Clifton Hale made one more move in the spring of 1883. He had spent the winter, apparently, in legal and political maneuvering of a more sophisticated kind than his previous direct approaches, and what he had assembled was a challenge to the original homestead, filing on the grounds of a technical deficiency in the initial survey that he claimed rendered the claim invalid. It was a narrow argument and a strained one, but it was the kind of thing that could theoretically create enough procedural delay to make the property unmarketable and the occupant's position uncomfortable enough that selling became the path of least resistance. Ellis Crawford saw it for what it was immediately. But what Hale had apparently not fully calculated was the degree to which Frances's 2-year fight and the collective water rights defense had built her a network of people with both the inclination and the resources to respond. Maron and the Garveys had a mutual interest in making clear that challenges to one homestead claim could create precedent for challenges to others. Robert Aldridge had connections in the local Black Methodist community that extended to political contacts in Austin, who had been watching the post-Reconstruction erosion of land rights with professional concern. And Ellis Crawford, no longer just a hungry young lawyer but a man whose reputation had been considerably enhanced by his success in the water rights hearing, had a colleague in Austin who handled exactly this kind of case. The challenge was answered within 3 weeks with a counterfiling so comprehensive that the judge who received it, a different circuit judge from Brant, but a man of similar temperament, dismissed the challenge at the preliminary stage without setting a full hearing. Hale received a letter from the district land office shortly afterward that suggested, in language that was formal and calibrated but unmistakable in its meaning, that further litigation targeting established homestead claims in Broken Creek County would receive heightened scrutiny from the district office and its connections in the federal land administration. It was, in the language of the time and the territory, the end of the road for that particular line of attack. Clifton Hale did not disappear from Broken Creek. He remained a large and difficult presence in the county for many years afterward, though the district investigation eventually resulted in consequences for the county clerk, who had altered the tax records, and several other officials who had been accommodating Hale's methods. Hale himself was never criminally charged, which was an injustice of the specific variety that powerful men in 1880s Texas were largely able to avoid, but the removal of his political infrastructure significantly constrained what he could do, and the awareness that Frances and her allies would fight anything he attempted made the cost of further aggression prohibitive. He sold the 2 parcels flanking the Sullivan homestead to Ed Marron 3 years later, in 1886, when a drought and a collapse in cattle prices made his over-leveraged operation vulnerable in ways that all his political maneuvering could not address. James heard about the sale on a Tuesday afternoon and came home and told Frances over supper, and she set down her fork and was quiet for a moment and then said, "Good. Now the water flows the way it should." Which was, James thought, about as perfect a eulogy for the whole business as could be composed. Their son was born in November of 1883, a year after the wedding, and they named him Patrick Robert Graves. Patrick for Frances's first husband and the dream he had carried west, Robert for the man who had been the best neighbor either of them had ever known. He was a large, loud, healthy baby who announced his opinions about the world with considerable force from his first moments in it, and Frances looked at him in the lamplight of their bedroom, exhausted and luminous, and said, "He has your nose." "God help him," James said. She laughed weakly. "James." "He's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," James said, and he meant it in the way that people mean things when they no longer have any reserves left for anything other than the truth. Patrick grew into a boy who had his mother's directness and his father's patience, and his grandfather Aldridge's way of watching the world carefully before committing to a position, which was perhaps the most useful combination of traits available in his particular part of Texas at his particular moment in history. He toddled around the homestead with a proprietary confidence, finding things and carrying them to whoever seemed most interested, which was usually Robert if Robert was visiting and James if he wasn't. Robert Aldridge watched the boy with an expression that James found deeply moving. Robert's own children were grown and scattered, one to California, one to Oklahoma Territory, and the distance was a specific kind of ache that he carried with his characteristic stoicism. Having a child named partly for him and running at his legs when he came to visit was, James thought, something more than courtesy. It was acknowledgement. It was kinship. The homestead grew over the following years. Not recklessly, but steadily, with the specific kind of growth that comes from making good decisions repeatedly rather than making one large fortunate bet. They expanded the herd incrementally, adding acreage when the opportunity came, and the price was fair. Frances began teaching again in 1885, when the county school board opened a school in a building 2 miles from the homestead, which was close enough to manage, and which paid a modest wage that she applied entirely to the purchase of additional breeding stock. James continued working for Marron for 2 years before Marron, who was expanding his own operation, suggested that James might want to consider establishing his own operation on the land rather than working someone else's. James came home and talked to Frances about it, which was how they made every significant decision. Sitting at the table, they had moved past the original in quality and size, in the house that had grown 1 room larger with Patrick's arrival and would eventually require another room, and laid it out in the direct, complete manner that had become the only mode they used with each other. She said, "I've been wondering when you were going to make that decision. I wanted to make sure the timing was right. The timing has been right for about 8 months," she said, "but I thought you needed to arrive at it yourself." He looked at her. "Were you waiting on me?" "I was letting you be ready," she said. "There's a difference." He left Maron's employ in the spring of 1886, the same spring that Hale sold off his flanking parcels, and threw his full energies into the operation that was now unambiguously theirs together, which had a symmetry to it that pleased both of them. The years that followed had their difficulties, because that is the nature of years in any country, and particularly in the Texas Hill Country in the late 19th century, which was a place that offered extraordinary reward, alongside extraordinary hardship in proportions that depended partly on the weather, and partly on the price of beef, and partly on who you were, and partly on what you were willing to do. There were droughts and there were years of good rain. There were seasons when the market paid well and seasons when it didn't. There was the summer of 1887, when a fence fire destroyed a section of pasture, and they spent 3 weeks working 18-hour days to save the rest, and came through it with nothing worse than scorched fences and deep exhaustion, and a renewed respect for each other's endurance. Their daughter was born in 1887, and they named her Margaret Ruth Graves, Margaret for James's mother who had died young, and Ruth for the woman Ruth in the Bible who had said, "Wherever you go, I will go," which Frances felt was the appropriate sentiment for someone born to people who had both, in their different ways, committed to something difficult and stayed. Maggie, as she was called almost immediately and would always be called, was a different creature from her brother from her first weeks, quiet where Patrick was loud, observant where he was active, with dark hair that came from somewhere in Frances's ancestry and eyes that were the particular gray-green of the creek in summer. She was a child who seemed to arrive already knowing things, which Robert Aldrich said meant she was going to be either a teacher or a judge, and Frances said that both were fine options. James watched his children grow with the particular and somewhat baffled wonder of a man who had never expected to have children, and found that he had been wrong about himself in this, as in other things. He had expected to be adequate at fatherhood, and found instead that he was good at it, that the patience he had always applied to cattle and land translated surprisingly well to small people, and that there was a specific kind of joy in sitting on the floor of the house in the evening building things from scrap wood with Patrick, or reading aloud to Maggie from the books that Frances kept adding to the shelf, which now covered an entire wall of the expanded house. They added a third room in 1888 and a covered porch in 1889, which was where James spent his favorite hours of the day, sitting in the evening with Frances beside him, watching the hill country light do its evening things, talking or not talking with equal ease. There were evenings when they talked for 2 hours about everything from the county politics to Patrick's behavior at school to a book Frances had read, and wanted to discuss to the question of whether they should sell some of the older steers that fall or wait until spring. There were evenings when they sat in a comfortable quiet that required nothing of either of them and offered everything. The quiet evenings were James's favorites, not because the talking ones were lesser, but because the easy silence between two people is a thing that has to be earned, has to be built from years of trust and intimacy, and the accumulated knowledge that the person beside you does not require performance from you, that you can simply be who you are, and that this is not only accepted but preferred. He had not had that before Frances. He had not known it was a thing that existed between two people as an ordinary gift of daily life. He was grateful for it with a depth that he could not always express, and that she, understanding him the way she did not require him to express. She turned 32 in the spring of 1889, and he was 34, and they had been married 7 years and had a homestead that was legitimate and growing, and a community that respected them and children who were healthy and 2 of the truest friends, a person could hope for in Robert and Maggie Aldridge. They had dealt with Clifton Hale and come out on the other side and built something from the rubble of what had been threatened. Robert Aldridge died in the autumn of 1890, of a heart failure that came quickly and without much warning, which was perhaps a mercy. James and Frances were with Maggie Aldridge when it happened, because they were the kind of people who showed up, and James stood by Robert's grave on a cold October morning and said the few words that the older man had asked him to say if the occasion arose, because Robert had been practical about his mortality in the way he was practical about everything, and the words were short and honest and true. Frances held Maggie Aldridge's hand throughout, and Patrick, who was 6 and had grown up calling Robert his grandfather in all but name, stood very straight beside his father with his jaw set in a way that looked so much like Frances that James had to look away for a moment. They brought Maggie Aldridge to stay with them for 3 months after, because she was 63, and the 40 acres to the north was too quiet and too far, and neither of them could have done otherwise. Patrick adored her presence, and Maggie the child spent hours in the kitchen with Maggie Aldridge learning things that Frances was the first to admit she had not thought to teach, and the old woman's presence in the house was a gift in the midst of loss. When Maggie Aldridge returned to her own place in the spring, it was with the understanding that she was not far and that the door was always open, which she knew had always been true, and which she said, going, was the thing that made going possible. Frances came in from seeing her off and stood in the kitchen with her hands at her sides, looking at the wall, and James came up behind her and put his arms around her, and she leaned back against him with the full weight of her tiredness and her grief. "He was the best man I've known in this county," she said. "Yes," James said, "he was a very good man." They stood there in the kitchen for a while, in the house they had built together, with their children in the next room, and the spring light came through the window, and the year turned, as it does, forward. Their third child, a son they named Thomas, was born in the spring of 1891, and he arrived into a household that had learned to hold both grief and joy at the same time, which is perhaps the most useful thing a household can know how to do. Thomas was loud and physical and passionate in the way that some children are, with enormous feelings about everything, and a specific gift for persuasion that Frances said came from somewhere in Patrick's family, her late husband's side, because she recognized the quality without being able to claim it herself. He was wonderful and exhausting in equal measure, and by the time he was 2, he had the entire household, including his older siblings, organized in service of whatever his current project was, and James would come in from the pasture to find Patrick engaged in some plan of Thomas's, devising with the resigned cooperation of an older brother, who has learned that resistance is more expensive than participation. It was around this time, the early 1890s, that Frances resumed something she had let go of during the hardest years of building the homestead, her writing. She had kept journals since she was a girl, had written letters throughout her life with a quality and a care that made Ellis Crawford, who saw some of them in the context of various legal correspondences, once remarked that it was a shame she hadn't pursued a career in law. She began writing, in the evenings after the children were asleep, something longer and more sustained, something that started as an account of the water rights fight and became, gradually, a fuller account of what it had been to come to this country alone and build a life here. She did not tell James about it for several months, writing in a separate notebook that she kept in the tin box that had once held the tax receipt, until one evening he noticed the notebook and asked, and she told him with a combination of matter-of-factness and a vulnerability he rarely saw in her that she had been writing about all of it, Patrick and the first winter and the fight with Hale and what came after. He asked if he could read some of it. She gave him the notebook and sat at the table watching him while he read, with her hands around her coffee mug and her expression doing the thing where it was careful and open at the same time. He read for a long time. When he looked up, she was still watching him, "Frances," he said. "Yes. This is extraordinary." She looked down at the mug. "I mean it," he said. "This needs to be read by people who aren't me." She looked up. "It's just a record." "It's a great deal more than a record," he said. "It's the thing itself, everything that happened, what it felt like from inside it, why it mattered. There are people who need to read this. Women who are doing what you did. People who are going to do what you did." She was quiet for a long moment. "You really think so?" "I know so. Will you do something with it?" She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was thinking and feeling at the same time, the way she often looked when something was arranging itself in her mind. "I might write more first," she said, "until it feels complete." "Take all the time you need," he said. "It will only be better." She sent the completed manuscript to a publishing house in Chicago in the spring of 1893, on the recommendation of the newspaper editor in San Angelo, whom she had referenced to James on that very first morning, and who had maintained a sporadic correspondence with her over the years, and who knew a few people in the Chicago publishing world. The response came in the summer, an offer to publish, modest terms, genuine enthusiasm from the editor who wrote back. Frances sat at the table reading the letter in the particular stillness she brought to things that mattered, and then looked up at James and said, "They want to publish it." Patrick, who was 9 and increasingly sophisticated about the world, put down the piece of wood he had been whittling and said, "Publish what?" "Your mother has written a book," James said. Patrick considered this with the gravity of a 9-year-old confronting new information. "About what?" "About this place," Frances said, "and the people in it." "Am I in it?" Patrick asked. "You're in the ending," Frances said. Patrick nodded, apparently satisfied, and returned to his whittling. Maggie, who was 6 and had been listening from the doorway with her characteristic quiet attention, came and put her arms around her mother's waist and said nothing, only held on, and Frances put her hand on her daughter's head with an expression that James kept in the repository of images he would carry for the rest of his life. The book was published in 1894 under Frances Sullivan Graves's name, and it was not a famous book in the sense of selling widely, but it reached a specific readership with a specific force. Women who were homesteading or had homesteaded. People in the East who had never seen the Texas Hill Country and wanted to understand what it was. A reviewer in a Chicago newspaper called it a work of remarkable clarity and moral precision, written by a woman who knows the cost of things and refuses to pretend otherwise. Frances read this aloud at the breakfast table and then set the paper down and said, "Moral precision." Patrick would have liked that phrase, meaning her first husband, and James reached across the table and took her hand, and she pressed it briefly before releasing it and going back to her eggs. The years settled into themselves with the particular quality of a life that has been built rather than happened into. James was 40 and then 45, and his hair was going gray at the temples, and his hands had the look of 20 years of hard use, and he was in every way that mattered more at peace than the young man who had ridden west from Missouri to become someone different from the person he had been raised as. He had become someone different. He had not known, riding west at 19, that the difference would look like this. A woman with copper hair going silver at the temples, reading beside him in the evening light, a daughter who could out-argue anyone in the county school, 2 sons of different temperaments who both had the stubborn core of their mother's character, a house on 160 acres that had been fought for and paid for, and filled with the evidence of people living intentionally, a creek that ran clear and cold through the back pasture. Frances read beside him on the porch in the evenings when the weather allowed, which was most of it, and sometimes she looked up from her book and looked at him with an expression that he had catalogued over years and still found capable of taking him slightly off guard, the expression that was entirely unguarded and entirely hers, and that said, more clearly than words, that she had chosen him and went on choosing him and considered this one of the better decisions she had made in a life that contained a number of good decisions. He felt the same way. He told her so. He told her so regularly. in the specific and particular language that two people develop over years of knowing each other, which is not always the grand declaration, but is often something much more daily and much more true. The hand taken across the breakfast table, the name said in a particular tone, the look across a room at a gathering that contains an entire private conversation, the sitting beside each other in the dark on the porch, when the summer lightning moved across the southern hills, and the air smelled of the possibility of rain. In 1896, Broken Creek County built a new schoolhouse, larger and better supplied than the previous one, and the school board asked Frances if she would consider serving as the head teacher, a position she accepted on the condition that the board also hire a second teacher so that the older and younger children could have separate instruction, which they agreed to after approximately one meeting with Frances, during which her reasoning was laid out with sufficient clarity that disagreement felt more like confusion than a coherent position. She taught there for 20 years. The children of the county who passed through her classroom came away with something specific, something that was not only arithmetic and reading and history, but something harder to name. The sense that their own minds were the most important tools they possessed, and that those tools required care and use and honesty to function as they should. A significant number of them went on to do things that surprised their parents. 2 of them went to college, which was not common in Broken Creek County in those years. 1 became a physician. 1 became a lawyer and eventually a judge, which would have amused Robert Aldridge in the precise way she had predicted. Patrick Graves grew into a man who had his mother's directness and his father's steadiness, and who proved up his own homestead claim at 21, and ran it with a seriousness that made James feel, watching him, something that was indistinguishable from pride. He married a woman named Ada, originally from San Antonio, who had opinions and a sense of humor, and who Frances declared was exactly right in the way that people who have good judgment about these things are able to determine quickly. Their first child was a boy, which pleased James in no particular way related to gender, and in every way related to the fact that watching his son hold his son was one of the better moments in a life that had contained an increasing number of better moments. Maggie Graves became, in fact, a lawyer. She left for Austin at 18 to read law in a practice that would eventually see her one of a very small number of women to practice law in the state of Texas in the early 20th century, which required a stubbornness and a clarity of argument that everyone who knew her origin had always understood she possessed. She came home twice a year and filled the house with energy and strong opinions, and the specific quality of challenge that a daughter who has grown into her full self brings to her parents. And Frances met her on every point with the delight of someone watching their best work operate in the world. Thomas became a rancher and a town alderman and an extremely vocal advocate for public water infrastructure, which everyone agreed was an entirely logical outgrowth of having grown up with the story of the water rights fight as part of his family mythology. He was loud and passionate and impossible to ignore, and he married a woman who matched him in all of these qualities, which made their household an experience, and their marriage a daily negotiation that both of them seemed to find exhilarating rather than exhausting. James Graves sat on his porch in the long evenings of his later years and thought about all of this, not in the way of accounting or measuring, but in the way of gratitude, which is something different. He had ridden onto this land with bad intentions and had come away changed, not all at once in a single dramatic moment, though that first morning had been its own kind of shock to the system, but in the gradual and permanent way that real changes happen, the way water finds the level of its ground. He had been, on that morning, with the orders in his pocket and the bad intentions in his heart, about as lost as a man could be without knowing it. The knowing had come from a woman with a pitchfork standing in a yard and the kind of steady clarity in her eyes that requires no weapon to be formidable. He had handed in his notice and come here and stayed. He had never once regretted it. Frances came out onto the porch one summer evening in the late years, with 2 mugs of coffee and the evening settling around them, and she sat beside him in the way she always sat beside him, close enough that the warmth passed between them, and she looked at the hills to the west with the light going the long amber of late evening. "You know," she said, "I was terrified that morning, when I first saw you coming down from the ridge." He looked at her. "You didn't show it." "I wasn't going to show it," she said. "But I was. I knew exactly what you were there for, and I knew that Hale was not going to stop, and I was standing there with a pitchfork and 34 head of cattle and 160 acres of Texas, and a complete unwillingness to give any of it up." "It was the pitchfork," he said. "That's what did it." She glanced at him. "Did what?" "Made me stop. Made me think about what I was doing. This woman standing in her garden with a pitchfork and no fear, or at least no visible fear. I sat on that ridge for a long time before I rode down. She was quiet for a moment. I didn't know that. You were too busy looking like you were unmoved by anything to notice." She made a soft sound that was almost a laugh. "I was very moved. I just couldn't afford to be visibly moved." He took her hand. She leaned her head against his shoulder the way she did in the evenings, the way that had become over the years one of the most familiar and most precious sensations he knew. "I'm glad you rode down," she said. "I'm glad you made the coffee," he said. She laughed fully, the full laugh that still rearranged things, and the evening held them both in the way that good places and good lives hold the people who have built them, with the particular gentleness that is earned rather than given, the gentleness that comes from years of honest labor and honest love and the choice, made and remade every day, to stay. The creek ran in the pasture below with its cold, clear, persistent sound. The water found its level. It always did.